and welcome. Thank you for this opportunity from the Ed Leaders Network, and thank you to you for taking some time to engage in some learning this afternoon around some practical knowledge, skills, and tools that can help you put the C, community, in PLC, professional learning community. Before we jump in too far into the content, I do want to highlight my Twitter handle at Chad Dumas, as well as the Ed Leaders Network Twitter handle and the hashtag Let's Put the C in PLC. Folks who tweet out during the course of this next hour or so and tag me and that Let's Put the C in PLC, I'll be giving away a couple copies of my book and actually the action guide that just went live during today. And so if you already have the book, I'll get you the action guide. If you don't have the book, I'll get you the book for a few folks who tweet out, as well as one person who tweets out will receive a complimentary registration to a mini course, a collaborative leadership mini course that I'm doing in February. So get your tweet fingers ready to go and tweet out during the course of this session. One of the great leaders and thinkers in education that I'm guessing most of you are pretty well familiar with is Michael Fullan. And Michael Fullan says that all the good work in schools is just tinkering, unless we clarify our identities as collaborators and as inquirers. Wanted to share this with you up front because I think it's very powerful, this idea. We're doing a lot of work in schools, and Michael Fullan knows a thing or two about improving student learning. And if he says that everything that we're doing is just tinkering, unless we get to the heart of our work as collaborators and inquirers, we're just messing around at the edges. So this time together is going to help us think about how do we clarify our work as collaborators and as inquirers. The agenda that I've laid out for us today, it's an admittedly ambitious agenda. I'm going to share with you some of the research very briefly. Where does this work come from around putting the C in PLC? We're going to spend most of our time around specific knowledge and skills to help you become better at your practice. I'm going to share with you a few tools that will be helpful for you, and then finally some time for Q&A. However, I do want to go back just one moment to the front page here. Arlen did mention that the PowerPoints are available in the handouts in the GoToWebinar box. If you prefer to be able to type on your handout, that link there, tinyurl.com/Chad handout, will bring up a document, a Google Doc that it'll force you to make a copy, and then you can take notes on that handout as we go. And throughout this time, if you want to use that to take notes on, whether you print it off as a PDF or use it as a Google Doc, it's up to you, but it is there as a resource for you. So let's think about, in addition to that 4-aspect agenda, there is a hidden triple track agenda that I have for you. And first of all is the content in which we're going to engage. That's these 10 elements of principal knowledge. Secondly, there's certain strategies that I'm going to engage us in learning with each other for our learning. And then third of all, we'll take a little bit of time at the end and reflect, what were those strategies and how might you apply them in your own setting, whether that be with students or with staff or with principals or with aspiring principals, applying that in that setting. So that's kind of like a hidden triple track agenda. The outcomes were shared with you as part of the registration process. And again, these are lofty outcomes. We're going to spend a chunk of our time thinking about these 10 elements. And I'd like for our time together for you to be able to walk away having a better understanding of what are these 10 elements that are needed to create a collaborative environment. And then specifically, what are some very specific strategies that you can use to build productive relationships? And then we'll spend a little bit of time, not as much, but a little bit of time around specific CIA work. And throughout our whole time together, this really is about how do we make sure that we get more done in less time and with greater group member satisfaction. So I've talked at you for a little bit. I'd like to invite you to think about these outcomes that I've shared with you and the agenda, those 4 chunks of the agenda. Which of these most jumps out at you? And just take a moment and pop your thoughts into the question field or onto your handout, whichever you prefer, and just which of these most intrigues you?
All right, Chad, we've got some people typing into the questions box. I'm seeing a C,
Perfect.
2 letter A's, another C, more done in less time.
Mm-hmm. Wonderful. Thank you. Getting more done in less time with greater group member satisfaction, because we've got so much to do and we only have a certain amount of limited time, and we want to do it while building community with each other. So thank you, Arlen, for sharing that. So what is the basis of this work? We know in the world around us that there's knowing doing gaps. I know that I need to exercise 30 minutes every day and I don't do it. There's a gap between knowing and doing. I was sharing this thinking with my wife when I was thinking about my dissertation proposal about how we know we've got like 50 years of research that says if you want to improve student learning, get teachers working together collaboratively on the right stuff to improve their practice and results for kids. We know that works. And I was lamenting with her how in my experience, it's not happening. And she kept asking me 5 or 6 times, well, Chad, how do you know that they know what they need to do? And finally, it occurred to me, well, maybe we don't have a knowing doing gap. Maybe we have a knowing gap. Maybe we don't know what we need to do to build a collaborative environment for teachers. And so I combed the research and was unable to find anyone who had said, look, building principle, this is what you need to know. Michael Fullen, he talks about great leadership and change stuff. The DeFores, they talk about specific PLC practices. Stiggins talks about assessment work, learning forward, professional learning. Like everybody has their little niche. Nobody had said, here's a list, principles, these are the 10 things or however many things you need to know to build this collaborative environment. So that's what I did. That was my dissertation. I combed through all their work, identified these 10 elements of principal knowledge. It received some accolades, as you can see there, from PDK as a best dissertation finalist, and Learning Forward gave it the best research award that year. And then I not only took that as a research, but then applied it in practice. And over the course of the next 9-10 years in Hastings, Nebraska, a high poverty, high diversity, and low performing district. When I got there, they were identified as one of 5% of persistently lowest achieving schools and districts in the state. And over the course of the next 5, 6, 7 years, by implementing these ideas, we were able to get 3/4 of the schools in the district recognized as national models because we improved student learning and we closed gaps. So this work isn't just theoretical, it's also based on actual practice on the ground. So what are these 10 elements? I do want to make sure that you're aware of, on the right-hand side there, these resources. There's a website link to nextlearningsolutionspress.com with some bonus resources that if you have the book, these will be more helpful for you. But if you don't have the book, they may be helpful for you anyway. So an overview of what are these 10 elements, a study guide to help you as you work your way through the book. And it also may prompt some of your thinking if you don't have it. And then third, each book has a checklist of these are the things a principal needs to know for each of these 10 elements. And a downloadable copy of that is available to you in the on that website. So that resource is available to you. Now let me share you just very briefly these 10 elements, an overview, and then we'll dig into them a little bit more specifically. So first of all, these 10 elements are not prioritized. I was unable to find anyone in the research says start here and then here, or these are the most important. In my opinion, there's certain of these that are more important than others. And I believe that number 1 is one of those. So this idea that charismatic leadership is not necessary for long-term success. So if it's not necessary, what is? That's going to be a chunk of our time today. The second element of principal knowledge is teaming teams for effectiveness. We know that when you throw a group, put a group, we don't want to throw anybody, but if we put a group of people together, they may or may not be very effective. And so how do you team people so that they can be effective? Third, making sure that our staff meetings are focused on student learning, that we're taking all that Administrivia and we're getting rid of it, not getting rid of it, we're putting it in ways that don't take up staff meeting time, that we're able to handle that so that our staff meetings are focused on adult learning. 4, principles of adult learning. In other words, there's some things that work well with adults that we need to be doing in order to make sure that we're going to create this collaborative environment. Number 5 is applying elements of continuous improvement and innovation. There is no one silver bullet. There's no one thing that all of a sudden you do this and all of a sudden, whoo, we're going to get great improvement. There's lots of little things that happen. And so what are those elements of continuous improvement? 6th is modeling your own professional learning. We are in the learning profession. And if we're in the learning profession, we ourselves as adults need to be learning. And as a school leader, we need to be engaged in that learning, modeling it and making it explicit for our staff. Number 7 is allocating resources. Many times we think about tangible resources like time, materials, equipment, space. But there's some intangible resources as well that we need to be thinking about and make sure that we're allocating so that we can be effective in building this collaborative environment. Number 8 is involving staff in important decisions. If you want to sync your change efforts, make all the decisions yourself. And so we need to understand that and know that there's certain things that go along with involving staff in important decisions. Understanding principles of student learning, like this is like the heart of our work, right? CIA, curriculum, instruction, and assessment. So making sure that we know what to look for and can ask questions in such a way as to further the work of our colleagues. And then finally, the number 10 really takes all these 9 elements and pulls them together. Like if you're doing these other 9, then number 10 becomes just a few key ideas around sustainability, around persistence, that it's hard work, etc. So that's kind of like this brief overview of these 10 elements. I'd like to just give you a moment to individually reflect either on the handout that you have in front of you or in the questions panel. Just reflect what like jumps out at you before we continue our conversation and I share with you some more specifics around some of these elements. Harlan, do you have anything in the question box or are people individually reflecting on their own?
Yes, we've got some reflections here coming in. Heather says, involving the staff is key to buy-in.
Mm-hmm.
Kayla says, number 3, I can't wait to learn more on keeping our meetings student focused.
Yes. Thank you.
Melanie
Excellent.
says, focus on staff meetings on student learning.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So what we're going to do here during my sharing of specific knowledge and skills is we're going to hone in on element number 1 and spend a good chunk of time on that. Then on 5 other elements, I'm going to invite you to take a little poll to find out where's the temperature of the room and who wants to look at which ones, and I'll dig into 1 or 2 of those depending on how much time we have. And then we'll wrap up with a few extra ones at the end that I wanted to pull out and highlight. And then, of course, go into the tools and Q&A, but this is the knowledge and skills portion. So this idea of charismatic leadership does not equal success. So the question that comes to my mind, well, if charismatic leadership doesn't do it, what does? And Michael Fullen, I love the way he says it. He says, relationships, relationships, relationships. Like this is everything. And you know this, I don't need to tell you that relationships are the sine qua non, without which there is nothing in any of education, any of life really. And so what I identified from the research is some specific practices that can help build relationships beyond the feel-good, chummy things that are important. And to really get to a collaborative environment, there's some key elements of relationships that will help you go further. And so these 3 big ideas are this idea of having personal clarity as a leader. Secondly, building an environment of dialogue and some principles of effective dialogue. And then third, this idea of what I call the 3+1. So thinking about personal clarity first, there's 3 elements of personal clarity that will help us in building more effective relationships. And the first is around language. So I always like to share a story around language, actually all 3 of these, that I think is really important. a good friend of mine that I have a really good relationship with is founded around Nebraska football. I'm a big Nebraska football fan. You can hate me for that, but I am a big Nebraska football fan. And he and I have a certain language that goes along with that, right? We talk about certain games, certain plays, certain people, certain, aspects of Nebraska football. And I'm sure you can relate if you've got relationships with folks that are both on other sports events. There's a language that goes around with that. Then there's goals. Like a winning season would be nice, but we'll set that aside for now. Like there's goals in terms of getting certain wins or to a certain bowl game or, championships, whatever. There's goals that are also associated with this relationship. And then finally, there's actions. When you go to a sporting event, there's certain actions that happen, right? After a first down, after a 3 and out, after a touchdown, when the teams take the field, there's certain actions that everyone does that helps to create these relationships. So in thinking about your role as a leader, what's the language that you use in your school? What do you talk about? What do staff talk about? What's the language we use around students, around curriculum, instruction, and assessment practices? What are the goals that we have for ourselves and for each other? And what are the actions that we're taking? So these 3 areas, if you as a designated leader can become clearer about these 3 big areas, your relationships will be stronger. So on your handout, I've given you a little bit of a space to reflect on your own use of language, personal and professional goals, and actions that you take to pursue the goals. Take a moment and reflect. Please don't chat it in, just reflect individually. I'll just give you like 60 or 90 seconds. What alignment or lack thereof do you notice for yourself around your own personal clarity? About 60 seconds. About 20 more seconds. I'm sure we can all relate to having worked for or with someone who wasn't very clear. Like they're all over the place. They're not very clear with their language, with their goals, with their actions. There's not alignment. And when that's the case, it's really hard to build productive, effective relationships with them. The second big idea of building relationships comes from the work of Paulo Freire, who was an educator and a philosopher from Brazil. And he wrote the book, Pedagogy of the Oppressed. And in there, there's a small little section that I think is just absolutely incredible that he refers to as these principles of effective dialogue. And in my opinion, if we can create this culture of dialogue where we're listening to understand as opposed to listening to respond, we will build better relationships and of course then create more collaborative environments. And so he identified 6 principles of effective dialogue that I'd just like to highlight for you a little bit about each one. So in terms of love, do you truly love your students? That's pretty easy. Do you love your staff? Do you love your parents? Do they know that you love them? What about the hardest to love ones, the most difficult parents, the most ornery staff, the most needy of our students? Do I really love them, and do they know that I love them? Regarding humility, Jim Collins did a study where he identified the best companies over the long haul that had the greatest returns on investment. And he identified level 5 leaders as being the key difference between great companies and just okay companies. And those great leaders, level 5 leaders, had 2 characteristics. One of them was an intense personal humility. So how does that translate? Like, what's an example of having intense personal humility? I'll just share one example in my mind of leaders who I have seen who've been intensely personally humble, excuse me, getting my tongue-tied. When you're in a meeting, do you speak first or do you speak last? Humble leaders, in my experience, speak last, not because they want to have the last word, but because they want to make sure that everybody's voices is heard. Because leaders understand that when they speak, they have influence, and they don't want to taint, if you will, the thinking of the others in the room. So therefore, they make sure that others have the opportunity to express their opinions first before themselves. Faith. Do I have faith that you'll do the right thing, that the team will do the right thing, and that the school will do the right thing? Do I trust that we'll follow through on it, that you'll follow through on what you say? Do I have hope? Hope, of course, is the ultimate of education, right? We're in the hopeful business. Do I have hope for the future, that tomorrow we will be better than we were today, and next year we will be better than we were this year, and the year after that, right? Ongoing hope. And of course, having this critical thinking. All of this is part of having this effective dialogue. So that's like the environment of this work. So you have the personal clarity, dialogue, and now let me spend just a few minutes around what I call the 3+1. I do want to share, I think this is really funny. When I was searching for images to use on this presentation, I put in the term rapport, because that's the +1, rapport, and it thought I put in raptor or something. So there's your image. I decided to leave it, that maybe an image of a raptor would help you think of rapport if I shared that story with you. So rapport is the +1, and then the 3 are some specific behaviors. So what is rapport? Rapport is being in relationship with someone. And that when you're in relationship with someone, there's some physical characteristics that you can observe, non-verbal interactions, patterns. And they manifest themselves in mirroring with each other, not mimicking, mirroring. So when we get out of this pandemic, go to a restaurant. Notice the people around you and notice who's in rapport and who's not. You'll be able to tell very quickly just by the body language. Things like overall body language. Are people, if one person's making large gestures, the other will also make large gestures if they're in rapport. If one person leans back, the other one will lean back. If one's leaning in, they're mirroring each other. And this is a powerful indicator of being in rapport. Same with voice tone. Is my voice tone going up and down? Am I speaking in an approachable voice, and this is how we're speaking? Or am I speaking in a credible voice, and my voice goes down at the end, and this is how it is? Listen and observe with the colleagues with whom you're interacting. Are you in rapport? Volume, people who speak really loud versus those who are quiet. When they're in rapport, they'll match each other. And finally, the intensity with which they're speaking. Not a person on the planet, I saw that on Facebook, not a person on the planet has ever calmed down by being told to calm down. It doesn't work, right? But if somebody comes to you and they're intense, and that's not your intensity, if you match that intensity and get into rapport with them, gradually you can bring their intensity down if you're thoughtful and intentional about being in rapport with them. So what are these 3 then? So rapport is how we go about doing it, and then these 3 specific behaviors: pausing, paraphrasing, and prompting. So pausing. If I want to build relationships with people, pausing is really important. By the way, these kind of go in that order. It's important to think about pausing first, then paraphrasing, and then prompting. And those of you who are familiar with cognitive coaching and adaptive schools work are well familiar with these powerful norms of collaboration. So with pausing, we know that the prefrontal cortex is the furthest part of the brain away from the heart. It's the slowest part of the brain. It takes time for blood to get there, and it needs time to think. Give it to people. Pause. When somebody comes to you and asks a question and they want an answer, pause for a second. Give them an opportunity to think. Give yourself an opportunity to think. More often than not, they'll continue talking after a pause, and eventually they may even solve the issue themselves. Pausing. There's actually a great article that just recently came out in Inc. magazine about how the Apple, Tim Cook, and other big CEOs are using the power of pause, the uncomfortable pause, I think is what they call it, to engage folks in building those relationships and generating thinking. After a pause, it's very helpful in building relationships to paraphrase for someone. So it sounds like you're talking about three things here. Blah, 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 blah. Or one of the things that's really important to you is that blah, blah, blah. Reflecting back. And what paraphrasing does is it does two things. First of all, it gives them an opportunity to make sure that their thinking is squaring right and they can clarify their own thinking. And secondly, it gives you an opportunity to make sure that you understand what they're saying. And then third of all, prompting with a question. So given these three big areas that you've talked about, where would you see ourselves needing to start to be able to move your work forward? So given the importance that you're placing on X, Y, and Z, what might be some next steps that you could take? How might I support you in that? These three tools of pausing, paraphrasing, and prompting are really powerful in building relationships and of course putting the C in PLC. So I've talked at you for about 12, 15 minutes here. I'll invite you to please take a moment, and again on the handout that you have, and write down these 3+1 and identify a time when you want to make sure that you use these, and then do it. So take about 30 seconds, identify a time when you want to make sure you use the 3+1. Okay, thank you. So I've spent a lot of time on this idea of building relationships, and within there are some nuggets around CIA processes and ways to lead CIA processes, as well as how to get more done in less time with greater group member satisfaction. But we're going to be a little bit more specific with that here in the next segment of our knowledge and skills. So as Arlen mentioned earlier, there's a poll that he's going to get out to you. And what I'll like to do is invite you to take that poll and identify which one of these do you want to learn some more about, and we'll spend about 10 minutes or so digging into one or two of those. So take that poll and we'll see what you think.
All right, I've just posted the link into the chat area, so you should be able to click on that. If you're having trouble with it, the URL is at the bottom of the screen, tinyurl.com/chad1-21.
Thank you. They're coming in. I got about 10 responses right now. 13. 16. We'll give it another 30 seconds or so here. 18 responses. 19. Okay, it looks like. Let me see if I can share my screen so you can see. Here's the responses here. So we got about half of us out of those 22 saying, let's spend some time on focusing our staff meetings on student learning. And then the next highest one is on applying elements of continuous improvement. So let's dig into focusing our staff meetings on student learning. Thank you. All right. So focusing our staff meetings on student learning. So this idea of reducing administrivia. So the way I think of that is that anything that can be done by email or memo should be done by email and memo. So for example, I've been in quite a few meetings where the principal stood up and talked to staff about things like, we just got to the Christmas break, right? And if your district is anything like districts I've been in, there's a lot of movies that happen that week before Christmas break. And so a principal will get up and talk to the staff for 5 or 10 minutes about don't show movies before the break. If you do, make sure that they comply with these criteria, right? In the middle of the wall. So unless that's something that you want to have dialogue with your staff about, don't have it at the staff meeting. Now, it may be that you need to have dialogue, but my guess is things like that, that's coming from central office, that's policy, the Board of Education is saying, do this, don't do that. There's no need to have a conversation about it. Put it in a memo. Dear colleagues, please don't show movies during this time unless they meet these criteria. Please let me know if you have questions. Now, it may be that there may be some questions and you might get into some CIA conversations around how do we make sure that our content is aligned to what we want it to be aligned to. And if we're using instructional practices, and if we think a movie is really important to show, what are instructional practices that are going to be helpful in doing that, whether it's Christmas or any time of the year, right, or the holidays. So taking, if it can be done by email, make sure it's done by email. Memos are pretty important to that process. My experience is simply asking staff, right? Staff want to make sure their time is used. Simply asking them at the end of a staff meeting, last 3 minutes, dear staff, I want to make sure that our time together is really well used. Would you please, on a sticky note, what in today's meeting could have or should have been done outside of the meeting in a memo or something else? Please give me that feedback, put it on a sticky note, I'll collect that. They're the best source of telling you whether or not it should be in a staff meeting or not, because they know how their time is being used or not used well, right? So that's a pretty powerful element of focusing staff meetings. And then the other thing is these tenets of leadership from Linda Lambert. Her work comes from, I don't know, 80s or 90s. She identified 5 tenets of principal leadership for you to be thinking about, for us to be thinking about around leadership. So the first one is that leadership does not equal leader. If you're the one who's running every staff meeting, there's something, you know, look in the mirror. How can I engage staff in running these meetings? Because if staff are running the meeting, guarantee that they're going to be focusing on learning. So thinking about, I'm not the leader, we are all leaders, and how can I build our capacity to do that work? The second one is that leadership is about learning. And so every interaction I have with staff and students is through this lens of learning. How do I make sure that we're engaging in this learning together? This third one of having the potential, the right, and I would add the responsibility to work as a leader. You know about having core teams in your school, right? Instructional leadership teams, advisories, school improvement teams, whatever you might call them. Making sure that we're using those teams to engage all staff in the work of leadership. I have a story to share, but I won't share it at this time. The fourth idea is that leadership is a shared endeavor. Again, if you're the one leading the whole meeting, it's probably not a shared endeavor. Some of the best school staff meetings that I've seen, the principal is part of a team and the teachers are leading that learning. And the principal is actively involved, right? They're not going and sitting in the back of the room with the newspaper up. They're actually engaged in the learning, working with staff to make that happen. And then finally, this idea of power has been inverted, right? It used to be that whoever was at the top, they held out all the power. And for the last, I don't know, maybe 200 years, that triangle has been inverting itself, maybe has fully inverted. And this idea that the leadership of the masses is the norm. And our job as designated leaders is to channel that leadership to make sure that we're improving our practice. All right, we are moving right along, and I want to make sure that I hit a couple of these other ideas before allowing some question and answer for you. So these are some additional elements of learning that are detailed in the book, and if you've got the PowerPoint in front of you, it's got some of the key highlights highlighted on there. I do want to just touch on a couple of additional knowledge and skills before providing you with some tools. So these two elements of modeling your own professional learning and allocating resources are pretty darn important. So with modeling your own professional learning, like I said earlier, we're in the learning profession. Our job is to learn. Are we modeling that learning? So for example, am I on social media and developing a professional learning network with colleagues? Am I going with other principals to their building and engaging in walkthroughs with them? Am I getting together with other school leaders and co-planning staff meetings together? Am I video recording my staff meetings and reflecting on it? And through all of this process, am I making that explicit so that staff know that I am a learner as well as them? In many ways, the building principal is the lead learner. So modeling that and making it explicit for staff. In terms of allocating resources, two types of resources: tangible, time, material, space, equipment. This has to be allocated in order for learning teams to be effective, to create this collaborative environment. And then what we don't think of in terms of resources is intangible resources. These also have to be allocated. What are intangible resources? Training of staff in procedures and protocols. Accessing external expertise when it calls for it. Building trust between teachers. These are some of these intangible resources that also have to be allocated. And so as a school leader, thinking about how am I making sure that I'm training people in protocols, that I'm building this culture where they trust each other, and that we're accessing external expertise when it's needed. And then the CIA of student learning. I contend that no principal can or should know everything about every content area, right? It's just impossible. You can't do it. What we can do is ask good questions and understand processes that will give us good outcomes. So these 4 questions, as I'm sure you're familiar with from the DeFores, what do we want kids to know and be able to do? That's curriculum. So in my mind, one of the most important things about curriculum is the verbs. What are we asking kids to know and be able to do? The verbs. And are the verbs at low level knowledge, or are they at high level synthesis and evaluation? And whatever taxonomy you use, asking questions to help staff think about, are we having kids engage in an appropriate, varied levels of curriculum through the verbs? Number 2 is how will we know when they know it? That's our assessment practices, right? And so Rick Stiggins goes into a lot of that work around kind of target, type of evidence. And are we matching that kind of target and type of evidence? I like to think of kind of target about crisping is what I think of it. Knowledge, reasoning, skill, or product. What level of learning are we asking? Knowledge, reasoning, skill, or product. What type of evidence are we asking them to provide to us? Selected response, extended written response, performance task. These need to match. And so as leaders, being able to ask those questions about what is the verb telling us? Is the assessment matching that? How can we make sure that there's greater match in those? And then questions 3 and 4 are the I in the CIA, right? The instruction. So what are we going to do individually, as a team, and as a school to make sure that we're providing both enrichment and intervention? Sometimes we get stuck on the intervention, but don't think about the enrichment. So thinking about how do we make sure that we use these 4 questions as leaders to ask the right questions to propel the environment forward, because these are the 4 questions that are critical to the work of PLCs actually doing PLC work. And then finally, as I mentioned earlier, these 9 elements, the 9 previous elements, if you do those, you're going to be most of the way there to leading effective change. Utilizing certain principles of change are just like the capstone. So understanding that real change is real hard, that it takes a long time, and we've got to work with our staff to build consensus as we move forward. So before I go into some specific tools that may be helpful for you, I'd like to invite you on the back of that handout. There's a little box there. Which 2 or 3 of these would you like to learn more about? Or which of these do you already know and need to focus on implementing? And if that's the case, what steps would you take to go about that? Give you about 60 seconds to individually reflect before I go into sharing some tools and Q&A. About 15 more seconds. Okay, so some tools that may be helpful as you go about putting the C in PLC. And I'd like to share 3 different kinds of tools. First is strategies. The second is some resources. And third are some services. So in terms of strategies, you remember that earlier on, I said that there's a hidden triple track agenda, that we had content to engage in, some strategies for us to think about, and some strategies for leading adult learning. And so what were some of those strategies that we use that you might be able to use with colleagues in the near future? So the first strategy I used was inclusion. So at the very beginning, I asked you to think about these outcomes and which one was most important for you. The inclusion activity is really important because it focuses our mental energy in the room. It gets all of our voices in the room, and it starts to see who we are in relationship to each other and to the content in which we're going to engage. Throughout the course of our time together, I've engaged you in some self-assessment and reflection for yourself, as well as some writing and planning of what you want to do. Of course, I also engaged in some pausing, allowing you to think and chat in some of your questions. I've used questions for you to think about and a poll. So those are some of the strategies that I used. In terms of some resources, there are some resources that I mentioned earlier, and I just wanted to highlight for them again. That's just to remind you that there are some free resources. Of course, the book is available on Amazon and Barnes & Noble, but these are some free resources that may be helpful in moving you and your staff forward. And then finally, there are some services that I provide to schools. And one that actually is just hot off the press that's pictured there is an action guide. So this is a more thorough than the study guide. So this action guide is a tool to help you be able to take these ideas and translate them to practice. Knowing gap, bridge to knowing and doing. And so there's some additional resources there for you that I'm not going to go through, but they're available for you if you're interested. So before we get to the Q&A, I wanted to come back to the outcomes here and take a moment and reflect on the last hour together. What is one question, comment, or aha that you have around these outcomes? And I'll give you a chance to chat that in. And while you're chatting that in, Arlen can bring up the Q&A and we can address some of the questions that you might have.
All right, thanks so much, Chad. This has been a great session here. Appreciate all the information you've shared so far. We do have some questions already in the chat, and we'll start with those, and feel free to type in your questions for Chad now as well. Alexander says, what do you do when your teachers don't read the memos and email? They will complain, they will complain when they get more than 5 to 10 a day in general, and they have no idea that we get 100 plus per day.
Yeah.
I've also learned the more emails we send as administrators, the more we get back, which can take us away from leadership, being with kids, and more. Your thoughts?
Yeah, so there's like a lot of elements to that question. So let me see if I can break it down little by little here. So the first one is, so you've got a lot to share with folks. So how can you make sure that, actually before that is, how do you make sure people read it? Todd Whitaker talks about who has the monkey on their back. And if we are sharing things with staff and not expecting them to read it, we're just taking the monkey right back onto our back. And so really it starts by us as leaders saying to staff, look, I'm not going to email you a ton, but when I do, you best read it. You best know what's in it. And if you've got questions, let me know. But this is how I'm going to share with you things that can be done by email. So that's the first thing, is like setting that stage, that expectations that this is what I expect. Secondly, it's on us as leaders to make sure that we're sending these out, like was said in the question here. 5 or 10 emails during the course of the day, no bueno. If it can wait, hold it off. Some of the most effective principals I've seen send out 1 email a day, and some actually even less than that, right? 1 email that goes out to the staff. There's also some great tools that you can utilize, because many times my experience is when someone emails you back, they're needing a conversation, and it's not really an email response that you can give. And so there's some great tools like followupthen.com and some other type tools like that you can put your email inbox into a mode where those emails get forwarded back to you at a certain point of time. So for example, music teacher emails you on Monday and asks you a question, and you know they're not going to be back in the building until Thursday, and you need to talk to them on Thursday. You can forward that email to yourself so that it comes back to you on Thursday, so then you can have that conversation with them without having it junk up your email, without having you to remember, ooh, I was supposed to talk to someone on Thursday. What was it on Thursday? What's the content? So I guess there's a few things that I think of, in that regard is limit your emails, make sure that you have the expectation that they do read it. And third of all, use some tools to help you organize so that you're able to have those conversations when you need to. I hope that's helpful for you.
Wonderful, thank you for that. Bridget asks, how do we stay focused on continuous improvement and innovation?
Yeah, that was one of the elements that we didn't get to. So continuous improvement and innovation gets to several things. First of all is making sure, this is like the backdoor way of getting this content into the session, so that's good. So first of all, making sure that there's a very limited number of goals. I would be hesitant to have, first of all, don't ever have more than 3 goals. And I'm hesitant to even have 3 goals because it's just too hard to do that many. So I think the first thing about continuous improvement is make sure that you've got a very limited number of goals, 1 or 2, that's it, that's enough. That will by itself help you focus on continuous improvement and innovation. Secondly, make sure that the selection of those goals and then the monitoring of those goals is based on data. Really important. Make sure that there's data as part of it. The third idea around continuous improvement is that continuous improvement, the most effective place for it is in small groups. It's not the whole staff. There's times the whole staff to get together, but most of the continuous improvement happens in small groups on the staff. So making sure that you're thinking about when we're in these team structures that people are doing that work. And then the final thing around continuous improvement and innovation is that it's lots of little things. Lots of little improvement add up to big improvements over the long term. So I don't know if that directly answered your question or not. I think it was Bridget was the question asker, but those are some ideas around continuous improvement and innovation, and hopefully those can help you kind of hone in on that.
Excellent, thank you. Brandy asks, is the workbook on Amazon as well?
Yes, it is on Amazon. It's not on Barnes & Noble or anything yet, but it is on Amazon, yeah. And they're actually linked on Amazon, so when you go there, it shows up.
And then Anne asks,
Google,
go ahead.
Yeah, if you just Google, put the C in PLC or Chad Dumas, it'll show up for you.
Anne asks, what was that resource you just talked about? Follow-up.net?
Say again?
What was the resource you were talking about? It was followup.net.
Oh yeah, followup.com. Let me look real quick. Followupthen. Followupthen.com.
There it is. Okay, perfect.
Yeah.
All right, this next question comes from Heather. She says, how do you create a safe environment to allow staff to share without jealous backbiting?
Yes, you're talking about building this trust, and which gets into effective teaming, and how do we build this trust? So first of all, and I should have said this earlier, as you know, leading a school is complex work. And there is no one silver bullet. And so what I'm sharing with you is just a few ideas here and there that may be helpful for you. When I think of staff that are maybe backbiting and there's not a culture where you can share effectively with each other, here's a couple of things that come to my mind. First of all, the most psychologically safe grouping is this many. 2. So as much as possible, staff meetings, getting people into groups of 2. Because if I'm working with someone who I don't necessarily like, to their face, I'm going to be very respectful. And as we're engaging with each other over time, I'm going to start to learn from this person. So that's one thing to think about, is how can I make sure that engagement with staff in these learning meetings is in groups of 2, maybe 3, but in groups of 2, creating this psychologically safe environment. The next thing I think about is how to get teams to be effective. There was a study from Google just 3 or 4 years ago, and they identified 2 characteristics of effective teams. They studied like 200 teams. 2 characteristics of effective teams, and it translates really well to teams in education. First of all, the extent to which people are able to read each other's body language, nonverbal communication. So helping staff with that. And if you go back to the 3+1, pausing, paraphrasing, posing questions can be very helpful in that regard. And then the second area that makes for effective teams, according to Google's study, it was a gigantic study, is that the degree to which there's equity of term taking. So in that regard, protocols become really important. So if you've got a culture where staff aren't trusting each other, think about how do I get them in 2s as much as possible. And then when they're in their small groups, making sure that we're using protocols to build that capacity.
All right, wonderful. Let's see here. Here's a comment from Melanie. She says, I want to learn more about team teachers for effectiveness. Needed to focus more on building relationships.
Yeah, teaming teams for effectiveness. Thank you, Melanie. So, so there's several things around teaming teams for effectiveness. So the first is how many people are in that team. I mentioned this is the most psychologically safe number, but that's not the most effectively productive number in a group. A team of teachers, to be most effective with their production, is 3 to 5 people. Once you get 6 or more, productivity starts to go down unless you've got highly skilled individuals. So the first thing about effective teaming is making sure that you've got groups that are the right size. Too many times you walk into a room and there's 10 teachers in the room, or 12, or whoever, and it's principals or teachers, whoever, I don't care who it is, you get over 6, the effectiveness of the group tends to go down. So what do you need to do? If you've got groups that are that large, find ways to make sure that they meet in small groups and then come back and convene periodically, but get those groups to be 3 to 5. The second thing in terms of the effectiveness of these groups is to talk to people. I tend to have very positive presuppositions of folks. And so my assumption is that you are a professional who wants to do what's best for kids. And so a conversation with you about what are your student learning needs? Based on your student learning needs, what are your learning needs? Based on your learning needs, what grouping of staff would make most sense to help you learn what you need to learn to be able to meet the kids' needs? Many times we group teams of teachers because it makes sense for a schedule. And so we need to think about what makes sense for the students and the teachers to impact student learning. And so a conversation with them it makes a lot of sense. Now, in some areas, that's pretty simple, right? The 3rd grade teachers, it makes sense for them to work, but it might not make sense to have the music teacher work with them, or the art teacher, or right? I mean, we've got to be thoughtful about which other teachers, because everybody, in order to be a collaborative environment, everybody has a right and responsibility to be on a team. And so we have to have those conversations with FACS. So 3 to 5 people, have those conversations with them to make sure that we've got the groupings right, and then use some of those strategies in terms of protocols and processes to be able to make sure their time is most effective. Hope that's helpful, Melanie.
Excellent, thank you, Chad. All right, we've got time for one more here. This is more of a comment, but a good way to kind of wrap things up. Cindy says, it seems like we never talk about students when we meet as professionals. I love that this is one of the elements.
Oh, thank you. That's wonderful. Really appreciate that. Susan, is that right? Was that?
It was from Cindy.
Cindy, thank you, Cindy. Appreciate that. So I do want to just remind you that if you tweet out, I'll probably around 5 o'clock Central Time, I'll take a look at who's tweeted out, and there will be some lucky winners for the book, as well as someone who will be a recipient of a free registration in the Collaborative Leadership Challenge in February. So again, thank you so very much for the opportunity, and look forward to hearing from you, and have a great rest of the week.
Excellent. Thank you, Dr. Dumas. All right, you are free to close the GoToWebinar control panel. That will log you out of the session. As I mentioned in the beginning, I will be sending out a link to the recording and a link to an online evaluation that if you complete it and you're from Illinois, you can get the ISBE evidence of completion form for your PD clock hours. I know that's important for a lot of you in attendance, and we only offer hours for those who attend live, not for watching the recording. But thank you so much for your time. Hopefully we'll be hearing from Dr. Dumas again. Thank you, Chad.
Thank you so very much. Take care.
All right, bye everyone.